Okay, hey everybody. Thank you for joining me today as we go over how to write a learning objective. Now, I don't want to insult you. I know you know how to write a learning objective, but you guys are in a really unique position as provisional teachers. You have demands placed on you that a lot of people never have to deal with. You have the demands of being a student, and then you also have the demands of being a teacher full-time for both of those. And that's not even including your family stuff and your friend stuff and relationship stuff. But today what we're going to focus on is writing a learning objective and how you can balance what your district tells you you have to do and then what Georgia State is telling you you have to do. So we're going to figure this out together, and I'm going to show you some tips and tricks on how to make this work. So I was given this, and it may look familiar to some of you guys. Technology. Okay. I was given this document by Rockdale County Public Schools that all science ed folk get to work with, and it outlines for them the standards that they're working with, the learning targets and types of learning targets that were set forth by the district, the depth of the learning target, and with as far as the depth of knowledge is concerned, which that's DOK, and then the formative assessment method. And they have their own shorthand over here to help us understand the types of options that you have for assessments. We're not going to worry about that today. That may be more helpful later on, but as far as for writing our learning target, our learning objective, we're going to focus on these first three columns. Okay, columns and rows, they throw me off, always have. Okay, so let's get started. So first off, why are these red? These learning targets red? Well, they're red because these are areas of focus for the district. They are ones that they have identified as areas of need. So these are super important that we make sure we include these things. Now, what does this mean over here, this depth of knowledge and these numbers? If you remember, and you probably have had a professional development on this in your district, depth of knowledge is on a scale of 1 to 4. 4 is the highest, 1 is the lowest. Questions and things that students are having to do can be measured on this scale. So this scale gets its comes from the idea of like how much knowledge, how much cognitive demand, so how much thinking power are students having to use to be able to do what we're asking them to do, to answer this question. And one easy way to kind of think about, okay, is this an easy thing for students to do, a 1, or is this something that's really going to take a lot of work, a 4, for students to do, is to think about Bloom's taxonomy. Now, you might have heard of Bloom's taxonomy. It is a nice, kind of like a pyramid of terms, of verbs, that we can think about as how much thinking does it take a person to be able to do these things. So when we look at some of these learning targets that have 1s beside them, like I can identify the location of the ozone layer, that really doesn't take a lot of knowledge. It really doesn't take a lot of thinking, does it? Because I can point at a map and say, there's the ozone layer. That's it. That's what that's saying to do. Or I can draw a picture and say, there's the ozone layer. It goes right here between these 2 layers. So that's not really difficult for our students. That's not really putting a lot of thinking or thought into having to meet that goal, right? So we can kind of combine some of these when we're teaching, and that's important to think about, because if you're just going to list all of these things, this is a lot. But if we mesh them and combine them and show how we're doing that, then it's appropriate. So we're going to show that today. Now, just so you have an idea what we're focusing on, this is 6th grade earth science, and we're focusing on the atmospheric layers and of the earth and greenhouse gases, and we're focusing specifically on the ozone layer. Now, the types of learning objectives that I'm going to come up with, they are going to come in a lesson that's maybe the 3rd day or the second day that we've spent on this standard. Okay, so here we go. Oh, man. I thought I was done. I thought I was ready to teach. JK, now I have to figure out what Georgia State wants me to do. Okay, so Georgia State not only wants me to like think about what my district has given me that I have to do, but now I have to add in measurable learning objectives, and I have to add in a type of assessment, whether that's formative or summative, and I also have to add in technology standards. Those are those ISTE standards. And then I have to add in the historically responsive framework. Oh, it's a lot to think about. And I'm not being facetious. I'm not being silly on purpose. Okay, maybe I am. But this is a lot to think about, to have to wrap our minds around. And it's okay if you're like, W2H, how do I do this? So we're going to do it. Now, I want to point out something to you before we move on. And you notice here this number 1 at the bottom says write a bulleted list, 1 to 3 objectives. That's more than 3. Dang it, now that means I really got to do some thinking, right? I can't be like my students and just copy and paste this. So, not only can I have to have 1 to 3, but it has to be clear and measurable. How measurable are those? Some of them are pretty measurable because you can either identify it or you can't. Okay, but how am I measuring that a student can analyze and interpret graphical data of pressure and temperature to create a description of each layer of the Earth's atmosphere? Well, that's not as obvious, is it? It's there, but it's not as obvious. So again, I gotta do some more thinking. But why do I have to include this measurable piece? My district says I don't have, it's not in my district stuff, so then why do I have to do it? Like, why is that even important? Why have a target if you don't know you hit the target? Why have a goal if you don't know how to hit that goal, or if you hit the goal or achieved it? Why have an objective if you don't know what the end game is and if you hit that objective? Having a measurable component allows you to do that. It allows you to say, oh yeah, Jaquan, he's advanced. Let me tell you why. Because he not only met this objective, he excelled. Because this is what I said had to happen, but let me show you his work. Look at what he did. I can't say that if I don't know what my measurable the measurable pieces of my learning objective. So, they're important. It's there for a reason. Now, let's move on. Okay, so what do you have to do? Well, you have to put what your district says, and you have to put what the expectation is for your program here at Georgia State to create your learning objectives for your Georgia State lesson plan. It's up to you if you include these in your district plan, okay? But this is what you need for your Georgia State plan, so this is what you need to get that grade, right? That's a lot of work. That's a lot of stuff. But you know what? We're going to do it, and I'm going to show you how easy this actually is. A lot of this work has already been done for you because you have access to these district documents. All right, so let's figure this out. So when I look at the district document, let's figure out how to start. First thing I got to do is look at the standard. Everything goes back to the standard. If I'm not rooted in the standard, then like, what are you doing? Okay, so what is this science and engineering practice in the standard? I feel like Dora the Explorer. You want to analyze and interpret data. How do I know that? Well, analyze and interpret data is the verbiage here, and the scientific practice is always going to be your verbiage, especially in these sub-standards. So we know this is S6E4A. B has a different verbiage. C has a different verbiage. But those verbiages that analyze and interpret data, in this case, that's always going to be your practice. So that's what my students have to be able to do. If they're not analyzing and interpreting data, then they are not meeting this standard. Okay? Disciplinary core idea. Where is it here? Well, they have to know the composition of the Earth's atmospheric layers, including the ozone, and they have to know about greenhouse gases. Now, the state of Georgia was real nice and gave you a clarification statement, and it gave you the layers that it wants you to talk about. There are more layers in our atmosphere than this, right? There's this thing called the ionosphere, super cool, but we talk about that in high school. That's not talked about here in middle school, and that's okay. That's called vertical alignment. And then how about the cross-cutting concepts? Not quite obvious, right? I don't really see it here. There's that compare word, but compare is not a cross-cutting concept. You know, cross-cutting concepts are things like structure and function. They are things like patterns, things like cause and effect. Can you think of a few that maybe we could use here? This is where the fun comes in. You get to make this choice. I personally, for the purpose of this PowerPoint, I'm using cause and effect. But you could easily use structure and function when you talk about the structure of the different layers of the atmosphere and the function of those layers. Easy way to bring that cross-cutting concept in. Okay, but you got to ask yourself these things when you look at the standard. And then let's look at our learning targets that my district has set out for me. Okay, so I've got these different kinds of standards. And by the way, our different targets, I mean. And by the way, these are all the learning targets for this standard that the district has put out. I didn't just cut some off, okay? So don't worry. So we have mostly K and R standards. I know K stands for knowledge. I'm not quite sure. I can't remember what R stands for. There's a lot of like education stuff on here, right? So what am I going to use? What am I going to use as my basis? I mean, I can identify the location of the ozone layer and make that be the basis of everything I'm wanting to teach my students. But that's not, I mean, that's a DOK level 1. My students are smarter than that. They can do more than that. They're definitely capable. So I'm going to look at some of these that have this DOK too. I'm going to use these to plan my lessons. So I could use either the first one or the second one here. I'm not going to read them to you. You can read them. But these also include the practice. They include the analyze and interpret or analyze here. And they are hitting on the disciplinary core ideas that are important to this standard. And they're leaving me the opportunity to incorporate different cross-cutting concepts that I want to use. So I'm going to pick one of these. And you know what? You can't do these without knowing those other ones on here, those other learning targets. Keep that in mind. Okay, so how do we put all this together? So I have what my district's told me. For the sake of this example, I chose just one of these learning targets to focus on, which is I can analyze chemical and physical data and use it to compare and contrast each layer of the Earth's atmosphere, including the ozone layer. So when I hear this, when I read this, what I think of is I'm going to, as a teacher, I'm going to give my students some data. I'm going to give them a data set. And then I want them to analyze this data set in order to compare and contrast each layer of the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, so I want them to do that. Keep that in mind. All right, so then I also have to add in what Georgia State is asking me to do, which is identities, skills, intellect, criticality, and assessment. Okay, there's some crossover here. Not remaking the wheel, okay? And then ISTE, I have to include ISTE. So I went to the ISTE website and looked at some of the standards, and based off of what my district is telling me that my students should be able to do, I was thinking, okay, well, I'm going to find something with data because they're having to use data. It's in my learning target. It's in my standard. So I decided to use 5B under computational thinker. Students collect data or identify relevant data sets. Okay, I'm going to give them the data set. Use digital tools to analyze them. Keep that in mind. And represent data in various ways to facilitate problem solving and decision making. Another thing to keep in mind. Okay, so I want to use all of these things to make learning objectives. Okay, so you're like, whoa, that's a lot. I have like all this stuff I have to put together, and I can only, my max number is 3. Yes, your max number is 3. If you have more than 3, you're doing too much. We don't need all that. Your students are not going to be able to do everything that you packed in there. That's not quality. That's quantity. We want quality here, okay? So let's make a learning objective. By the way, LO is learning objective. Again, we like our not acronyms. Is it an acronym? I don't know. We like our shorthand in education. Okay, so I'm going to start with the district learning target. I will always start with the district learning target. Okay, so here it is, off to the side. Now, I need to think about what I have to do. What all do I need to do here? So I need to make sure I have a learning objective that incorporates cross-cutting concepts. I need to make sure I have a learning objective that incorporates identity. I need to make sure I have one that incorporates the ISTE standard. I need to make sure I have one that incorporates criticality. And then there should be some intellect and skills in these things. Of course, there should be the practices, and there should be some disciplinary core ideas. Now, luckily, the one that I have from the district that I'm starting with, I already have the practices. I already have the core ideas. Now I just have to add some little extra stuff. No big deal, okay? It's not that hard. So I decided I'm going to do my ISTE standard first. You could do them in whatever order you want, okay? But I did ISTE first because I was already thinking, what do I want my students to do? Well, based off of the standard I have from ISTE, which is collecting and identifying data sets, using digital tools to analyze them, and then represent the data in various ways. Okay? So, what did I do? I took the district learning target, bam, and then I modified it. So, students will analyze chemical, physical data sets using Excel to create a graph, including all layers of the atmosphere. Okay? Well, my ISTE piece is what I have in red here. They're using Excel to create a graph. How does this meet what this ISTE standard says? Well, they have the data set. I've given it to them. They're using a digital tool to analyze it, Excel, and they're able to represent their data in various ways. I just said a graph. Notice I didn't say line graph, bar graph, histograph, any other kind of graph, pie chart. They love pie charts. I didn't say what kind of graph. I just said it had to be a graph. And that's on purpose. I want my students to figure out what graph works best. I don't need to tell them that. They need to pick a graph, and then they need to tell me why they picked that graph. All right? So, it needs to also, this graph needs to include all layers of the atmosphere. Well, they'll be able to compare and contrast each layer when they have to answer questions about their graph. I'm not just going to have them make a graph and that's it. They got to tell me something about it. So, what's all included here? Well, it includes the disciplinary core idea, it includes the practice, and it includes the ISTE standard. It also has a form of assessment. They're creating this graph. They can turn this graph into me. It is a tangible form of assessment, and it's a skill. Using Excel is a skill. To make a graph is a skill, okay? And it is measurable. They are having to include all the layers of the atmosphere. If they don't have all the layers of the atmosphere, they didn't meet this learning target, this learning objective. Capiche? Capiche. All right, so I've done ISTE. Check. All right. Now, I brought this back up, my thing I have for my district, to remind me of all the other learning targets that are there. Okay, so I have this one I'm focusing on, but like, is there a way I can bring these in here? Because like, I want to work smarter, not harder, always. And I also need to remember that we're talking about criticality, we're talking about identity, and we're also talking about cross-cutting concepts. how can I make all these three work? Well, this is the ozone layer. The ozone layer, even if you don't teach earth science, you know the ozone layer is kind of like controversial, right? There's this hole. So how can I incorporate that stuff? Well, let's see. I'm just going to focus on criticality first because that's a big thing. All of these things are big things, but in this case, I'm going to use criticality by itself. So what I came up with is that students will develop an explanation for why changes in the ozone is a world issue by focusing on the role and location of this atmospheric layer. Do you see role and location of this, meaning the ozone layer, anywhere else on my slide? I do. It's right here. Bam, bam. That's important. And you know what? Students may also bring in about greenhouse gases and changes to the atmosphere. That's not specific in my learning objective, but it's a possibility. That's how they would exceed, right? That's how I would say Jaquan exceeded this. Look, he was only asked to focus on the role and location of the ozone layer, but he brought in all this other stuff. Now, this hits on a criticality point. And why is this critical? Well, we're talking about the whole world here. This is a world issue. This affects everybody. So this is asking my students to think about the world and not just Conyers or South Fulton or Atlanta or Georgia. It's asking them to think about the big picture. Look at the whole forest. Don't just look at the trees. And that's a critical piece. Okay, so here you can see these are the different things that this LO includes. Disciplinary core idea, the practice, which is develop an explanation. The K learning targets, there's criticality. It has a form of assessment. Okay, they're going to have to develop this explanation. That explanation could be oral. It could be something they tell me in class. It could be a flip grid. It could be something they write where they have to answer questions. It could be a warm-up. It could be a ticket out the door. It depends on what I want to do with my lesson. And it's measurable. If they don't include the role and the location of the ozone layer in their explanation, then they didn't meet it. Okay? So that's LO number 2. LO number 3. Again, always start with my district learning target. Always start. Those people pay your bills. Always start at the district learning target, okay? Now, also, it's there. Work smarter, not harder. Again, I'm going to continue to look at what my district's given me. They've done a lot of work already. So I just need to build off of this. So, okay, what do I have left that I have to do for Georgia State? I have cross-cutting concepts. We haven't talked about that yet. And I have identity. Haven't talked about that yet. Okay. So, remember, I can have up to 3 learning objectives. Here goes my third one. So, again, I have students will construct an explanation about how their individual actions can cause or prevent ozone depletion by including 3 key terms about greenhouse gases. This is important, and this goes with what I've been asked to do this first district learning target, because they're having to talk about the ozone layer, and these physical and chemical data points that they have can be included in this. This type of learning objective is one that we could use as a question about their graphs. Okay, that's one way you could incorporate this. So, how does this meet the cross-cutting concept part and the identity part? Well, the cross-cutting concept part I have read in here. Cause or prevent. This is cause and effect. Okay, we're talking about cause and effect. Your actions can cause, that's the cause. The effect is what happens to the ozone layer. Okay. The individual actions, this is identity. This is having those students have to think back on what their actions are. Now, I might have my students share this because this is a great time. We would talk about this in class because they have different ways of living their lives and they do different things. And so this would be a great time to talk about their actions and how some of their actions may impact the ozone layer more than others, vice versa. Okay, and also notice that here we are, I'm incorporating this, I can identify and explain how greenhouse gases affect the Earth's atmosphere and climate. So that's another one. I can describe gaseous compositions of the Earth's atmosphere. If I have Jaquan in my class, I know he's going to bring up that ozone is O3 and that chlorofluorocarbons cause problems for that. He really pushes my boundaries, makes me a better teacher. Ugh. So include in this learning objective is the disciplinary core idea. I have my practice, constructing an explanation. I have my cross-cutting concept, which is cause and effect, and I have an identity piece. There's also a form of assessment in here, which is they're having to, again, either verbally or writing their explanation, and a skill, being able to think about the science concepts that we're talking about, and how does that relate to them? How do their actions influence what we're talking about? That's huge. It's huge. They're not in a bubble. This is real world. I mean, you're in a bubble. It's called the atmosphere, but still, I love science. Okay, and it's measurable because they have to use what? 3 key terms about greenhouse gases. Okay, if they use 2 key terms, sorry, you did not meet my standard, my learning objective. If you use like 6 key terms like Jaquan, you blew it out of the water. Okay? So, and this is what I mean. It gives you a marker as to where did your students learn about it? Did they meet it or did they not? All right. So, final product. So I had to take all of this stuff here from Georgia State, from my district, from ISTE, thinking about criticality, and I had to put it into one lesson. It's hard, y'all. But you know what? It makes you a better teacher. You don't want to be average or else you wouldn't be in this program. So, these are my learning objectives. They look a lot different than those targets, right? But guess what? Those targets are in here. They are full of the learning targets that my district has said I have to do. These have everything that Georgia State says I have to do. I have met what ISTE says I have to do. And you know what's even better? Is I have pushed my students to be amazing. And I have pushed myself to be an even better teacher than my peers. You're in this program because you're going to be a teacher leader, right? Teacher leaders do this stuff. Non-teacher leaders copy and paste what the district's given them, and then that's it. Okay? So, this is difficult. It's not easy to do the first time around. I'm going to be honest with you. But the more you do it, the better you'll get. The more practice you have. It's just like anything. If you don't work out, then how flexible are you going to be? You're going to be like me, who's not very flexible, because I don't work out. Okay? But the more you work out your brain and the more you think about this, the better you'll be. I bet you can look at this and you can figure out what my lesson looks like just based off of my learning objectives. If I told you we talked about the ozone layer the class previous, and the one before that, we talked about the different layers of the atmosphere, or maybe I just had one class before, we talked about the different layers of the atmosphere and focused on the ozone layer, and now we have this, boom. My kids are going to learn this. They're going to know it. They're going to own their knowledge. They're not going to rent it from me. Okay? And that's the goal here. So, if you have any comments or questions or anything like that, please put it in the running comment thing over here to the side, and I'll make sure to respond to you guys and to help you out with this. I hope this was helpful. I hope it makes more sense to you about how I can take what my district is telling me to do and my school is telling me what to do and put it together so that I kill 2 birds with 1 stone and also become an amazing teacher. Well, you're already that. Well, you're getting there. You're almost there. We're halfway through the year. Hopefully by the end of the school year, this will be no problem for you. Okay? Again, let me know if you have any questions, and I'm here to help you out. All right. Great job, guys. Thanks for sticking with me through all of this. I know it was a lot.